Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you joining from around the world. We are still waiting for additional participants to join us, so we're just going to get started with a few housekeeping issues as we wait. It's a real pleasure to welcome you today to this webinar on integrating the education sector into the National Adaptation Plan processes. Thanks so much for taking time to join us, and thank you to our partners at the NAP Global Network, all of our speakers and panelists, and all of you who are working at the intersection of climate adaptation and education. I'm Veronica Valdivieso, the project director for the Building the Climate Resilience of Children and Communities Through the Education Sector. BRACE is the short name for that project at Save the Children, and I'm moderating today's session. We wanted to just highlight a few accessibility features that we have since we have a global audience today. If you want to have live captions, you can select the More Actions menu in Meeting Controls and then choose Language, Speech, and Show Live Captions, and that should show up for you. And you can also translate the captions for the webinar. You can select caption settings, then language settings, and then choose your preferred language for the translation. And if you have any problems with any of these features, just please post a message in the Q&A section or chat, and we can try to have someone assist you. Something that again, the All right, I think then we'll go ahead and get started. So today's session is really the launch of two great new resources that have been developed by the NAP Global Network and Save the Children. One of them is designed to support NAP teams so that they can better integrate education into national adaptation planning. And there's also a companion guidance note that is really aimed at ministries of education as well as education sector actors who are, seeking to engage more effectively in these processes. These resources really draw on a growing body of evidence and also experience on climate resilience education systems and NAP processes, and they integrate the lessons that have been learned through the Climate Smart Education Systems Initiative, CESI, which we'll talk a little more about later, as well as BRACE and the NAP Global Network's general experience. So this conversation is important for a simple reason. Climate change, as I think we're all quite well aware, is increasingly shaping the ability of education systems to deliver safe, continuous, and equitable learning. So across many countries, we're seeing climate hazards really affecting infrastructure, disrupting learning for children, and placing more pressure on education systems than they already have. And so today's discussion is really focusing on how adaptation planning can help education systems respond more effectively to those challenges. Schools really sit at the center of communities. Teachers, school leaders, education planners, and even children themselves are powerful agents of preparedness, adaptation, and change as well. So if we're able to really equip education systems with climate information, then when sector plans reflect climate risks and when schools are safer and more resilient, we protect learning. And that way we are strengthening the capacity of communities to adapt and thrive in a changing climate. So over the last several years through SESI, which is supported by the Global Partnership for Education, Save the Children, along with UNESCO and IIEP, has worked with a number of countries, 35 countries actually, and partners to better understand climate risks to education systems and also to identify really practical pathways to really strengthen resilience. So through that work, we saw increasing recognition that climate adaptation and education planning can't happen in separate silos. Ministries of education, we saw really eager to engage on climate adaptation, but they needed clearer entry points in order to do that, as well as stronger evidence and stronger connections with the national climate planning processes. So BRACE has been building on the foundation that SESI has laid. It's a pioneering partnership between the Green Climate Fund and the Global Partnership for Education, GPE for short. BRACE has been supporting governments in Cambodia, South Sudan, as well as Tonga, so that they can strengthen their climate resilient education systems and really position education as a core component of national adaptation efforts. And BRACE also has a very strong global learning and knowledge sharing component. And through that, we're helping to generate evidence, we're sharing practical lessons and building a global community of practice that really is at the intersection of climate and education. And we're doing that through tools such as webinars, including this one. So by linking country experience with global policy, financing, technical discussions, BRACE is trying to accelerate action beyond the three countries where it's directly implemented. One of the clearest lessons from both SESI and BRACE thus far is that education ministries really can't do this alone, and climate ministries cannot do things effectively without them, without the education ministries as well. So the partnership between GP and GCF reflects that same principle. Achieving climate resilient education systems requires us to really bring together expertise, finance, policy leadership, and implementation capacity across sectors and different institutions. And it reflects a growing recognition that education has to be part of the climate adaptation conversation, because schools and learners really face climate risks, and also education is essential to strengthening adaptation and resilience across society. So Save the Children has really continued this approach through the partnership that we have with the NAP Global Network. The NAP Global Network is an initiative that has been working since 2014, actually, to enhance national adaptation planning and action in a variety of developing countries. And they've actually provided support to over 90 countries through peer learning and technical assistance over the last 10 years. The partnership between our two organizations has allowed us to leverage the unique opportunity of NAP processes to bring education and climate actors together. So through the NAP process, countries can identify adaptation priorities, strengthen coordination, mobilize investment, and track progress over time, all of which obviously are essential for building resilience in the education sector. And for the education sector itself, engaging in the NAP process helps ensure that the impacts of climate change on learning, schools, and teachers and children are visible within the national adaptation priorities, and that education is recognized as a sector that needs adaptation and is also a powerful enabler of resilience in its own right. And our experience also shows that meaningful integration requires a lot more than recognition. Countries really need climate risk evidence for the education sector. They need the capacity to translate that evidence into planning and policy. They need coordination mechanisms that can bring together ministries of education, environment, finance, disaster management, and they also need pathways so that they can go from planning to implementation and investment. So the resources we're launching today are really critical for all of that to happen. They help answer a practical question that many countries are grappling with, as we'll hear about from our panelists. How can education be more effectively integrated into adaptation planning processes? They provide concrete entry points for NAP teams and ministries of education to help bridge the gap between climate adaptation and education planning. So I really hope today's discussion helps us move beyond asking whether education belongs in adaptation planning, and that we can have a more practical conversation about how we can make that integration happen, how we can build the partnerships we need, how we can generate the evidence, strengthen institutions, and mobilize resources that we need to create climate resilient education systems for children and young people. Thank you again for joining us today, and please feel free to say hello and introduce yourself in the chat. So today we'll hear from Bapon Fakrudin from the Green Climate Fund and Sarah Beardmore from the Global Partnership for Education to start us off. Then we'll have a presentation from Jen Merriweather from the NAP Global Network and Save the Children. And we'll conclude with a panel discussion from Dr. Lim Sothiep from Cambodia's Ministry of Education, Youth and Sports, Hafsa Omar Abdullahi from Somalia's Ministry of Environment and Climate Change, and Lillian Kampango from the UNFCCC Regional Collaboration Center for East and Southern Africa. We're really delighted to have such a diverse group of participants from across the climate and education communities, and I look forward to the discussion ahead. We're recording this session and we will share the video and slides with participants afterwards. If you have any questions, comments, or technical issues, just let us know in the chat box, as I said before, and our colleagues will try to assist you. So it's now my pleasure to hand over to our opening speakers. Let's hear from Bapon first. He's the Climate Investment Principal at the Green Climate Fund. He's a globally recognized leader in water security, climate finance, and disaster risk reduction. And he has over 25 years of experience in more than 40 countries, where he's mobilized more than $10 billion in climate finance and advanced science-based solutions for resilience. Over to you, Bapon.
Thank you so much, Veronica. It's been a pleasure to be joining here today. And good morning, good evening, or good afternoon, wherever you're joining from various parts of the world. Thanks for joining us in this very important webinar. And also colleagues from NAP Global Networks, Save the Children, Global Partnership for Education, and others. As the world's largest climate fund, dedicated climate fund, GCF mandate is actually to support how actually we can pursue to the countries on a low emission, as well as climate resilience development. And as we often support various sectors, we should not actually forget that education is one of the very critical and interlinked, cascading and compounding sector, which actually binds all other sectors that we support, either on the adaptation side of it, as well as the mitigation side of it, in a sense. But if you look at on our education sectors, we often actually consider, I think for the too long time, education as a social sector. But I would say actually this is a community asset, and it is actually a very critical sector that's interlinked and interconnected to our whole adaptation sector. So in that sense, we actually need to take it very, very seriously, because when there is a flood happen or when any kind of natural hazard actually comes to our vicinity or our community, schools actually use as a very critical asset, or we call it for a safe haven for our community to taking shelter. But at the same time, if that actually prolonged, it actually created disruption of the education. It actually disrupt the social cohesiveness. It also disrupt the community activities. So in that sense, it is actually quite critical hub for place for learning, and also it's a place where actually we need to be support more on the how we ensure that actually the overall actually those assets are actually safe for climate resilience, such as water supply, sanitation, early warning systems, learning platforms, as well as long-term adaptive capacity. Because once the children learns, they actually an advocate for the society, for the family, for the community to create a resilient society. And that helps us to understand learning as well as build a nation who can actually, a future nation who will be actually leading our society as well as our country. And as a climate fund, when you're looking at just for the funding perspectives, um, climate for a climate fund, climate risk is actually one of the fundamental. That actually how a climate risk, climate hazard is actually creating a climate risk, and how that risk is actually creating barrier to our education sector. And these are all actually fundamentally coming through the National Adaptation Plan or NAP process. And I'm very glad to see actually the NAP is actually joining with us in this particular journey, because if we are not actually articulate education as a critical sector into NAP process, we'll not be able to actually prioritize the funding, prioritize the government policy as well as government blessings to support to the sector, and how to understand actually how critical this particular sector actually need to be bring. And also allocating the various kind of financing, not only just donor funding, but also national financing, but also other multilateral fund. Those are actually coming to the country so that actually the sector actually able to get an attention, sector able to get justice, sector also able to get the support that actually it needed. We are very glad to support the BRACE initiatives together with GPE as well as with Save the Children, which really demonstrate a critical illustration that how actually climate and education actually actor can actually work together, support education through the NAP process, as well as climate information and early warning systems, how to enhance the safety of the schools, how to enhance the connectivity from the family and society, linking to the school as well as asset as well as curriculum. So I think this is a project that actually demonstrates that how a sector could actually look like, and how the sector actually bring an importance to supporting to the other sectors. So I therefore warmly welcome to the new resources that actually bringing launched by the NAP Global Networks as well as Save the Children. Congratulations. And I think they arrived in a very important moment. So we really support and encourage that to actually mainstream as well as support as disseminate as much as possible to the wider community. And GCF look forward to continue to work together with the BRACE project to Save the Children, GPE, as well as NAP network to strengthen adaptation outcomes, as well as which matters more, or how the community could be more strengthened. So I hope today's discussion that we'll be hearing from others will be bringing a strong bridge as well as between the climate and as well as education as well as stakeholders, and unlock the practical collaboration and solution that is required to our most needed, most vulnerable communities. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Bapon, for opening our webinar with those words. Now I'd like to share the remarks from Sarah Beardmore from the GPE. She heads up the Global Partnership for Education, Strategic Partnerships and Capabilities team, and develops and leads multi-stakeholder initiatives to support education in the Global South. Unfortunately, due to the time difference, she's not able to join us in person, but she sent through a recording of her remarks. So let's hear from Sarah.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Beardmore, and I'm joining today on behalf of the Global Partnership for Education. I'm honored to be with you here today to discuss the critical issue of climate adaptation in the education sector. To give you a sense of why this issue matters so much, I'm recording this message currently in Canada, where wildfires have destroyed hundreds of acres of forest, and entire communities have been burned to the ground. These wildfires are getting worse and worse with every season, and when this happens, the sky is hazy, the air smells like smoke, the streets and playgrounds are empty, children have to be kept inside. Um, and these kinds of consequences hit our children the hardest. Flooded classrooms and heatwave closures are turning the climate crisis into a learning crisis. Cyclones, floods, and fires wreak havoc on schools worldwide, disrupting learning and development gains. For children, the stakes could have never been higher. And yet, education is also one of our most powerful levers for climate action. Climate resilient school infrastructure, early warning systems, safety drills, and the integration of adaptation content into school curricula all contribute to children, teachers, and communities that are better equipped to identify climate risks and withstand climate impacts. The imperative is clear. The education sector must adapt. And to do so effectively, it must be embedded in the National Adaptation Plan, the NAP process, which sits at the heart of each country's formal response to climate change. Historically, education has been an underrepresented sector in NAP processes, but there's growing momentum and commitment to change this. For education sector stakeholders, understanding how to meaningfully engage in the NAP process is critical. Done well, it can elevate education priorities within national adaptation decision-making, strengthen the case for dedicated adaptation financing for education, and help align education sector plans with national climate commitments across related sectors, including infrastructure, WASH, and social protection. Equally, for NAP teams, understanding the key components of a climate-resilient education system and the entry points for integrating education into the NAP process is essential. A resilient education system is central to building the adaptive capacity of children and their communities, which speaks directly to the NAP's core objectives. The two new resources being shared today are designed to build on this momentum. They aim to provide both education ministries and NAP teams with emerging best practice and evidence to move from commitment to action.
Thanks so much to Sarah for pre-recording those remarks. Now let's turn it over to Jen Merriweather. She's an education specialist at the NAP Global Network. She's on secondment there from Save the Children, and she'll be presenting the two knowledge products for NAP teams and education ministries. Over to you, Jen.
Thanks, Veronica. It's great to be here today to launch these two new resources. The first, a briefing for NAP teams on integrating the education sector into the NAP process, and the second, a guidance note for education ministries on engaging in that process. These resources have been developed with the generous support from Irish Aid and the Global Partnership for Education. And in the next few minutes, I'll outline why integrating the education sector into the NAP process matters, what the benefits are, and the key entry points and approaches highlighted in these resources. So these resources were developed in partnership by Save the Children and the NAP Global Network, and we're really grateful for this partnership and the NAP Global Network's expertise. So I'd like to start with the case for integrating the education sector into the NAP process. Why does this matter? As we've heard today, climate change closes schools, disrupts learning, and threatens the health, safety, and well-being of students and teachers alike. Over the past 20 years, schools closed in at least 75% of climate-related extreme weather events, and in 2024 alone, 242 million students had their education disrupted due to climate change. Every lost school day has far-reaching implications for a child's well-being, learning, and future. At the same time, education is also critical to supporting children and their community to develop the skills, knowledge, and understanding they need to adapt to a changing climate. Children are a group that are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, but they are also powerful agents of change. Strengthening their adaptive capacity through education can create benefits that extend well beyond the classroom, reaching their families and communities. Before we ask ourselves how the NAP process can help strengthen the climate resilience of education systems, it's useful to ask, what does a climate resilient education system look like? In both resources, we frame this around three main components. The first is climate resilient education infrastructure, where schools and other education facilities are built, retrofitted, and maintained to better withstand current and future climate hazards. The second is school safety and educational continuity, so students and teachers are kept safe and their health and well-being is protected and learning continues after climate-related disasters. Finally, the third component is learning and teaching. Climate change is integrated into formal and non-formal curricula, and teachers are trained and supported to deliver this effectively. So, how can the NAP process help strengthen the climate resilience of the education system? Through the NAP process, countries identify and address their medium and long-term priorities for adapting to climate change. Importantly, the NAP process puts in place the systems and capacities to make adaptation a part of regular development planning and budgeting. It's a critical opportunity to identify and prioritize the adaptation needs of the education sector. And there are many benefits to doing this. It can help to set out a national commitment to adaptation in the education sector. It can ensure comprehensive adaptation approaches and investments in the sector. It can coordinate approaches to adaptation between education and other sectors such as infrastructure, WASH and health. It can track progress and learning about what works. And it can also increase access to climate finance for the education sector. However, while interest and momentum are growing in terms of integrating the education sector into the NAP process, a key question remains. How do we do this in practice? What actions can NAP teams take? And how can education ministries and the wider sector be supported to engage effectively in the process? These two new resources are designed to help answer those questions. The briefing for NAP teams aims to support them to effectively consider education sector adaptation needs in the NAP process, providing an overview of a climate resilient education sector system, key enabling factors, and practical considerations for including the education sector at each stage of the process. The companion guidance note for education ministries explains the NAP process and sets out approaches, considerations, and tools to help education ministries and other education sector actors engage meaningfully. So what's in these two new resources? One of the things that might be a challenge for education ministries and NAP teams alike is knowing where to start. As such, for education ministries, the guidance note outlines initial steps for finding information out about the NAP process, such as identifying the NAP focal point, participating in climate change coordination bodies, and engaging with partner networks. It also provides links to resources that can help ministries get started. For NAP teams, the briefing highlights three initial steps in a summarised checklist: engaging the education ministry throughout the process, through including them as part of NAP consultations and in the NAP coordination mechanism, engaging children and youth through their representative organisations and other civil society organisations and education sector actors in the process, and exploring climate finance sources to understand what resources exist to support early preparedness and adaptation in the education sector. Our guidance note and briefing also identify entry points in each phase of the NAP process. They explain why each phase matters for the education sector and suggest practical actions that both NAP teams and education ministries can take. So, for example, in the impact, vulnerability and risk assessment phase, NAP teams and education ministries can work together to identify what schools, education facilities, and students and teachers are most at risk from climate change. Through the planning phase, NAP teams and education ministries can identify and prioritise adaptation options for the education sector in response to these key climate risks. The implementation phase is where education ministries and NAP teams can work together to share funding and resourcing needs for adaptation actions, investment plans, and budgets to ensure effective delivery of adaptation measures for the education sector. And finally, in the monitoring, evaluation and learning phase, this tracks the progress and success of these adaptation measures for the sector, especially for the most marginalised children. The resources provide more detailed actions that NAP teams and education ministries can take at each phase. To close, I wanted to highlight two case studies. The first is St. Lucia's development of an education sectoral adaptation strategy and action plan led by the Ministry of Education and supported by the NAP team in the Department of Sustainable Development. The Ministry of Education is a member of the National Climate Change Committee, which has been important for strengthening institutional arrangements between education and NAP teams. The second example is Somalia's roadmap for implementing education adaptation activities under its NAPs. Education was identified as a cross-cutting sector in the NAP, and the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change recognised the need to further define implementation arrangements through a roadmap. And this roadmap now sets out priority actions and implementation timelines for education adaptation, as well as clarifying institutional roles and coordination. These are the kinds of practical steps needed to move education activities in the NAP from planning to implementation. And we're really lucky to have Hafsa Omar Abdullahi from Somalia's Ministry of Environment and Climate Change here with us today, and she'll speak about this work in more detail. Together, these case studies show what's possible when the education sector is meaningfully integrated into the NAP process. Stronger coordination, clear priorities, increased opportunities for resourcing, and more resilient education systems for children and their communities. That's it from me. I hope you download the resources and find them useful in your work. We'd love to hear about it if so. We're now going to head straight into the panel discussion, which I'll be facilitating. So I'd love to introduce our panelists today. So first of all, we have Dr. Lim Sothia, who is Director General of Policy and Planning at the Ministry of Education, Youth and Sports of the Kingdom of Cambodia. With over 2 decades of experience in education policy and planning, Dr. Lim has been instrumental in leading policy development, strategic planning, and coordination across government institutions and with development partners. We also have Lillian Kempango, the Regional Adaptation Specialist at the UNFCCC Regional Collaboration Centre for East and Southern Africa. Lillian has dedicated experience in climate change adaptation research, capacity building, and fostering international cooperation with a primary focus on Africa. Hafsa Omar Abdullahi is the Director of Environment at the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change in Somalia. Hafsa is an environmental and climate change professional with expertise in climate policy, environmental sustainability, gender, and education. Thank you all for your time today. So let's start the discussion. Dr. Lim, the first question is for you. So Cambodia's Ministry of Environment, Youth and Sports collaborates with the Ministry of Cambodia's Ministry of Education, Youth and Sports collaborates with the Ministry of Environment on integrating education into national climate policies and ensuring that climate adaptation is integrated into education sector planning. From your perspective, what are some of the key data, evidence, and capacities that can really support education ministries to engage in the NAP process?
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation to the panel discussion on the climate change adaptation today. I'm very honored to be a part of this discussion. And as you know that climate change is a global issue and it is our agenda right now. And climate adaptation is not only environment activity, but it involves with the development, human capital, and child right agenda and education system resilient priority. Cambodia, as other country, is somehow facing climate change related risks such as flood, heat stress, drought. It can be disrupt school access, attendance, school infrastructure, learning continuity. From this regard, from the region, Ministry view education must be protected from the climate change impact and play a driver for national climate change resilience as well. So far, Ministry Education, Youth and Sport are able to integrate that concept into Education Strategic Plan 2024 and 28. And we also develop kind of 3-year operational plan for climate change adaptation, environment sustainable in education for 2028 and 23 and 28, which focus on 6 strategic areas, including climate change resilient promote safe education continuity, enhance learning for climate change resilience and action, and promote teaching for climate resilience and action, and develop environmental friendly school and program, and strengthen management for climate change resilience and environmental sustainability. So uh, one the key message is we are right now ready to we are able to understand the concept of climate change right now, and we are able to work together to hand in hand to build kind of resilient climate change resilient in the education sector. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lim. That was wonderful to hear about that work that you have undertaken. Turning to you, Hafsa, Somalia's Ministry of Environment and Climate Change recently released its roadmap for implementing the education activities in Somalia's NAP. Could you tell us a bit about why education is a critical part of Somalia's NAP process and how this roadmap will support adaptation interventions for the education sector?
Hello, good morning to you all of you. So thank you very much, Geneva, for inviting me this webinar and making Somalia also good practices for the countries who integrated their national adaptation plan and their education system. So I can say Somalia is one of the countries that already interconnected how the NAP and the education system work together, because Somalia is one of the countries that climate change affected the most, and it affected our livelihoods, specifically those live in rural areas. So I can say the critical and point that makes Somalia education, international adaptation, it can be interconnected reasons. So for the first, the education system itself in Somalia is highly exposed to climate change, recurrent droughts and floods. It damaged many schools, it displaced learners, it interrupted attendances. There is one example for the 2023, there is El Nino that happened in Somalia. One of the cities called Platwayne, they are in 12th grade students, they didn't get the time and opportunity to attend their final exam, and then the government they organized another exam for them because there is every place and there are floods. So I can say all these challenges it undermine learning continuity, specifically for girls, children, and the disability internally. Sometimes they are displaced from one place to another, and their education system became gap. So the roadmap, and I think as you see it, it already recorded how the flood disrupted education system and close to 900,000 children and damaged more than 700 schools. While that's the only flood effect. While the drought affected more than 2.4 million school-aged children, which cannot get the opportunity to join the schools. So building climate resilience in education, Somalia uses as adaptation priority. So, and the second point, education also needs and to make it enable adaptation through the society. So to make easier the society to understand how can we use in climate resilience education system, we encourage it to the and our line ministries or the in general for the curriculum of the country to integrate climate change classes or courses, and also to train the teachers, and also to make some community outreaches to make it practical skills that can people and understand specifically for the children and young people, those who work as farmers and pastoralists, to understand how climate risks and have been to prepare emergencies and adapt locally. Also, education, therefore, and builds the knowledge, skills, and long-term adaptive capacity needed to turn Somalia's national climate change policies into the community level, which can work both education system and climate actions. So the roadmap already we developed it. We are using as a practical bridge between planning and implementation. It organizes NAB education priorities because Somalia, we have a federalism system which has a different status, and every state has its own condition in the geographically and climatic condition. There are many priorities in our national adaptation plan specifically for education, like integrating climate change into curricula, in a teaching system, climate resilience school infrastructure, expanding community awareness. So we collected these priorities into our roadmap and we make it and pillars. That pillar, it has a priority activities, timelines, who is responsible, and potential implementation partners that can work together to implement those activities that make education system Somalia stronger to climate change. So we also in the roadmap propose stronger coordination through the climate change team and also the education team, and how can we work together. So finally, I can say that this roadmap in Somalia moves from broad commitment, which we derive from our NAP, and then specifically making education and into NAP roadmap, which can coordinate and make it something measurable intervention is make it implementation should protect education during climate change happening and other emergencies while enabling schools and learners community to become active contributors to Somalia's climate resilience in education way. So I can conclude the points that our roadmap highlights in that area. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hafsa, for outlining that work that's been done on the roadmap. And I think I've seen a question about whether or not it's available in the chat, and it is, so we can pop the link in there as well. Lillian, welcome. Thank you for joining us. You're working directly with adaptation focal points across East and Southern Africa to support their NAP processes. Why do you think that the education sector is becoming more of a focus in national adaptation planning, and how countries in the region currently approaching this?
Yeah, thank you very much, Jennifer. Good morning, good evening, whoever is joining us on this important webinar. As already introduced by Jennifer, it's very nice that I actually do work with the adaptation focal points and NAP focal points. Mostly I'm supporting the NAP formulation, tracking the submissions to the Secretariat, but also providing capacity building to help these countries align their NAPs with the updated NAP technical guidelines while making them responsive to climate critical sectors. And of course, as already highlighted by my predecessors, really we see that education is one of the critical sectors that is being affected by climate change. So why education matters to adaptation planning? I would like to talk about two reasons. One of the points is that education is both a vulnerability, but also a delivery channel. So we see that schools across the world, even within my region, most of these are physical infrastructure that are exposed to climate hazards. For instance, floods, the cyclones, heat, drought displacements, among others. And students are heavily affected. And these learning losses during the climate shocks is now more recognized as a development cost and not just a side effect. So at the same time, we also see education system reaching nearly every household. So this makes it one of the most effective platforms for building long-term adaptive capacity. So this is mostly done through curriculum, teacher training, school-based early warning awareness, among others. So these dual roles is why adaptation focal points are really starting to treat education as a cross-cutting sector rather than an afterthought. Then the next point is that there has been evolving process in the NAP. Mostly or initially, early the NAPs in the region heavily focused on critical sectors such as agriculture, water, health, and because these sectors had clearest climate data. So as countries are now moving on into implementation phase, the recent updated NAP technical guidelines emphasizes more on cross-sectoral coherence, and this is pushing more of the focal points to really look at at including education, previously where it was siloed under ministries of education rather than the climate institutions. So countries are now increasingly starting to map education into vulnerability assessments. For example, looking at school infrastructure resilience, self-transport to schools during extreme weather or disruption to girls' education, among others. So how is the approach, or how are the countries approaching this in the region? Now, the fact that I do work with the region, I know what's happening. So for the East and Southern Africa, specifically, I would describe the approach as still emerging but active. So most of the countries do not have yet a standalone educational chapter in their NAPs. So, but we see that education relevant elements appear inside the broader adaptation priorities, disaster risk reduction plans linked to ministries of education, wash in schools component, and gender responsive adaptation programming that includes girls' school retentions as an indicator, etc. I would say some examples, for instance, countries like Tanzania, Uganda, Malawi, among others, are some of the countries that have really shown good examples on how education stakeholders are being pulled into the NAP consultations even before a dedicated sector plan exists. However, what's less still common, even globally or let alone regionally, I would say that the teacher training is an explicit adaptation action and meaningful consultation with children and youth themselves in shaping these priorities. Thank you, Jane. Over to you.
Thank you, Lillian. Thank you for giving us that overview of that work that's happening in the region and why it's so important for education to be part of the NAP process. Returning to you, Dr. Lim, I'd love to talk about moving from planning to implementation for the education sector in the NAP process. And one of those critical elements for this is climate finance. So through SESI and now through BRACE, the Ministry of Education, Youth and Sports is working to expand access to climate finance for climate resilient education initiatives. What are some of the main things that ministries of education need to consider when identifying and exploring options for climate finance, and how can the NAP process support this?
Okay, thank you very much. I'm talking experiences and what we implement the SESI program. I take this opportunity to thank to GPE for support this kind of technical cooperation project where we learn a lot from the expert on what is climate change and also to be ready for kind of a response and also be a more education resilient for that. And I think we were able to assess the current situation where the education affect from the climate change and also build more understanding of our key staff, including those who are work in political policy level and technical level, including teacher who are expert in curriculum development, teacher trainer, youth, and also planning, statistics, and all this understand the concept of the climate change. And from there, we opportunity receive the grant from BREF. Thank you to Global Green Fund and GPA as well. So the program is being implemented and with the four main area, including policy and also cross-sector coordination. We see that the climate change address and beyond the climate change resilience is not work alone. The Ministry of Education Youth Sport had to play and work close with other ministry, including the Ministry of Environment, Ministry of Water Resources is something. Because otherwise, Ministry of Education just work out alone, but that need to be addressed cross subsector as a whole. And in terms of school building, we work with other development partner as well, to come with a kind of school model we adapted with the climate change resilient. So this is what is component number 2, and third is about learning itself. It's need to bring down to the school level activity, including the in curriculum and also outdoor or extracurricular at the school, because at the school is activity is a very powerful which impact on the community and the school, and also train a number of teachers to be a core trainer for the climate change resilient at the teacher training college. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for kind of outlining that wide range of stakeholders, and from that planning policy level all the way down to school level. Thank you for taking us through that. Hafsa, we might come back to you. So coordination between the education ministries and between the education ministry and NAP teams is critical, especially as NAPs move into implementation phase. So how does Somalia's education roadmap aim to strengthen those institutional arrangements between the two ministries? And what's your advice, I guess, to NAP teams and education ministries who are trying to strengthen this coordination?
Yeah, thank you very much again, Jennifer. So for this coordination, how the Education Ministry and NAP team, which NAP team is under Ministry of Environment and Climate Change. So we can say coordination between the Education Ministry and Ministry of Environment and Climate Change work together for implementing this roadmap. So the education roadmap already, and that have been released recently, it strengthened institutional arrangements by clearly separating and then connecting the responsibility of the two ministries. So the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change is the institution that led the formulating of National Adaptation Plan, and also we hope it will lead the full implementation of National Adaptation Plan, while the Ministry of Education and also Ministry of Environment is oversight of all related climate issue, while the Ministry of Education and Culture, Higher Education Somalia already leading implementation within the education sector, including curriculum integration and teacher training and all related education staff. So the central coordination, and there is a mechanism which is already in initial stage, which is developing or establishing the Climate Change and Education Task Force, which is contained team from Ministry of Environment and Climate Change and team from Ministry of Education that work in how to deliver those activities related to climate education. So the roadmap already proposed it, formally mandated and strengthened this task force with the two ministries serving as co-chairs. The task force also have to have agreed terms of references, membership, report lines, and with the formal reporting of inter-ministerial technical committee of climate change. Because when we are developing national climate change and NAP, we established the team called it Interministerial Technical Climate Committee on Climate Change, which works all climate change activities, whether education or any other sector. So the already roadmap proposed some phases, which is from formalizing the coordination platform, so clearing tasking, force mandate, co-chairing, arrangement is membership reporting line, and also undertaking joint planning. Whenever sector related climate change, it has to be coordinated, specifically now for education, how to make annual work plans, to define the project is, how for now they are working session. So team from Ministry of Environment and Climate Change participate all the consultations and activities related to SSC to make a priority intervention and to check how to align these activities with the National Adaptation Plan, specifically education priorities, and also education sector plans, and and the budget is because so when we are developing our National Adaptation Plan, specifically education sector, we managed a budget for implementing these activities. So when the Ministry of Education are doing some activities, we are seeing how it is aligned what we have already done. So also it oversees the implementation and to resolve and update priorities and coordination implementation. So for now, the ministries and they lead preparation of detailed costly climate change adaptation strategy. For now, they are working with their safety children. So the ministry is a part of it. Mostly Abdurrazak and other team, they are working with them closely to make them aligned to National Adaptation Plan. For the advice of the NAP team, I can say I was the lead of Somalia's formulated national adaptation plan. So, and for me, and as a giving them advice or anyone who will work the implementation is to work how before when we are developing general not we work in institutional coordination, we develop this committee, and for now everybody who will work the implementation and my advice is to work cooperation should not only depend on personal relationships. Sometimes in Somalia, we solve for some issue by phone, we talk to each other, and then, but we have to make it something formally mandated mechanism with a senior leadership, designated technical focal points, clear responsibility and establishment report management arrangements. So that it will make important to build coordination around practical training practice. Environment and Education Ministries should develop work plans, share results. So finally, I can say coordination should extend beyond the two national ministries because those are the federal system, but there are a federal member states line ministries which work is education and climate change. So I can say we have to work together with the environmental authorities, or the environmental ministries in the federal member states. We can work together with those who work finance, because if the Minister of Finance are allocating some budget of education, we have to think those activities, it has to be included some activities that work as climate change and education. And it can help to reduce disasters and also to help the vulnerable groups in Somalia. So bringing these actors together can reduce duplication, connecting climate expertise with education delivery system, and ensure that adaptation intervention respond to conditions experienced by schools and learners every day in Somalia. So I can stop here. Thank you for mentioning that. Over to you again.
Thank you, Hafsa. We are fast running out of time. I'm sorry, it's a great conversation, but Lillian, I will just end with the last question for you. So what is your advice to adaptation focal points who want to integrate the education sector into the NAP process? Where should they start?
Thank you very much. First of all, I think there's no science fiction for adaptation focal points. What I would say is that first of all, they need to start with the vulnerability assessment and not the ministry. Before approaching the Ministry of Education, focal points should really ensure that education is explicitly included in the sectoral or the thematic vulnerability and risk assessments that underpin the NAP. For instance, if the school infrastructure exposed or learning disruption data or education-related displacements isn't the evidence-based, then it won't make it into the priorities of the result framework later. So this is the technical foundation that really gives the education stakeholders a seat on the table when discussing the integration of education into the NAP. Then the next would be to build the institutional bridge early. Ms. Hafsa was already talking about the cross communication and coordination with the different institutions. So ministries, education ministries are rarely part of the national climate change committees. That one is something that we have seen at least within the region, or even do they take part on the NAP technical working groups by default. So the focal points should proactively bring these Ministry of Education focal points, teachers training institutions, school infrastructures, agencies into the NAP governance structure, even if they are as observers or technical advisory committee initially. So this early representation prevents education from being bolted on at the validation stages. Then the next would be to anchor it in the existing entry points and not do a parallel process. So we understand that there is already links or policies that do exist. For instance, the sector education strategy plans, school safety or DRR frameworks, climate resilient infrastructure standards. So aligning these instruments the Ministry of Education already owns makes the uptake of the financing realistic given how stretched education ministries are already. And lastly, we know that finance is really very important as a means of implementation for the education adaptation strategies. So while we call upon the focal points to integrate education into the NAPs, let them make sure that most of these adaptation strategies identified for the NAP are already costed for financing. So an education priority that isn't costed rarely attracts finance. So this is most times where I spend much of my time helping countries to translate the adaptation priorities into the education that are fundable, costed actions that can access climate finance rather than competing solely for the already stretched domestic budgets. So my honest advice to the focal point starting the journey would really start with the relationship early, assess before you prioritize, and cost before you finalize. So that sequence most times serves better, saves a lot of time. Thank you, Jenny. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Lillian, for closing us out on that. Yeah, I think that was some really, really fantastic advice. We are out of time. I'm so sorry we haven't been able to get to audience questions, but we will send around to the recording to everybody who's attended and registered, and any questions in the chat will also answer in a summary document that goes out with that. So I'd just like to say a really big thank you to all of our panelists and our speakers today for joining us, and thank you for everybody for attending and being part of this conversation. And please do reach out if you're interested in more information, and let us know how these resources are helping you or how you're approaching education sector integration in the NAP process. Okay, great. Thank you so much, everybody. Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Chào bạn. Chào chị anh. Thì